Tambana yesi nuetse diha unado nues canon chu unave nuhare nacha iku dezu helinu si don chanane yelu si eyiha nuetse diha.
He stood there saying a prayer. Kisemanto, I hope I'm doing right. Joseph Gunn stood behind the man.
Ja nisi dan ustan badas janisi. Eye bazi don tene kode ja tareht ja esa. Holo hano tanisi. Otie yekada Darrell jahde. Bazet ho. Hol jade gastjani. Dat ustan badas jasi nu ninu ha. Dat ubetori alosi. Eye asi tane bechani dat akanade baze otibe badazelt ide yeredu il chude because ja ade ayer castronole konde had because I dealt at the home then I saw sine nisi you got all jana got ze dino and sa dan not certainly when I did in that saru get out and hot or and now be honey not saru edit be honey it's out honey then I was we at here because I judged on that three nuke and that's a day. Don't know who the say. Check who ha. And knock it done a call. Only don't see not a right sarhound. Call yade a yaredo. There not no none the stock and I take somebody yet at some batara. The way we have understood Treaty 10 through our Dene language was that the Crown, the British Crown, was seeking to create a sovereignty for the global community that was starting to flow into indigenous lands and into our area, specifically aimed at approximately 230,000 square miles of northern, pretty well north central and all the way up to the Northwest Territories and then bordering present-day Manitoba to the east and past Treaty 8 west bordering Alberta. It was a huge land area that was predominantly Dene and Cree people. The reason behind that number of treaties was supposedly to avoid conflict, to avoid war, and that better terms would be met if they talk to individual areas and the people to create pacts, to create a way that they could conduct negotiations that would meet their sovereignty. The trade-off was not very fair, and in effect, when they started negotiating, already the Dene people from the 16th century and dealing with British ships for furs had brought in also pandemics with them. So plagues, smallpox, and other unknown sicknesses entered the huge lands. So by the time 1910 or 1906, when Treaty 10 was being negotiated, the people at that time were still dealing with these health impacts. There were many stories amongst the elderly people who were tasked with collecting the survivors of plagues that hit. So right during that time when the commissioners came in, the people were being traumatized by these events. And many were not really cognizant or had concepts of leadership. There were so-called traditional headmen, but that word headman, the head, the thinking faculty of specific individuals within each camp that could think clearly and initiate a sacred breath. So there were orators to that effect. So being that they did not have leaders, the Crown, through the commissioners, selected or forced the traumatized people to come up with leaders so as they could segregate the many who did not know of what was happening. So this Treaty 10 area that was signed in Lacrosse, signed here. This is the original English River First Nation, 192. The rest are 192A, B, C, D, and E. And that was for the locales of Sucker Point, Pachanak, Dipper Lake, Promo Lake, Knee Lake, Cree Lake. And that was in such a large land mass area, and the immediate need to segregate people that they could talk to and say, this is what we are about, and this is what you are about. So the directive and the storyline was already being manufactured. And many of our people at that time did not fully understand the English language. And so they relied on the missionaries who were versed in the Dene language and in the Cree language. The sentiment of the missionaries, of course, came from the European mindset. And so regardless of their so-called love for their parishioners, they still had to abide by the countries of their origins, in this case France, in this case England, even if their denominations were not in balance together. They still were the ones who carried the language sufficiently enough to have some kind of communication between the commissioners and the native people, the Dene and the Cree. So there were all kinds of challenges already that the people were facing. And many of the Dene that I knew and heard of did not acknowledge the idea, because they said in Dene, this is holy. Or they created a paper, Tsamba Nasya, means they dealt out money. That was the concept that many of the elders that were not part of the negotiations understood it as. And even during that time, there was no concept of any land deed handover. So the sovereignty of the historical drama that had been initiated fell on deaf ears practically, since they could not speak the language and since they were absent. So a lot of the ways that it could have been interpreted was left to the Crown. So the Crown was the one who started getting into modern treaties because of the oratorical groundwork that had been laid down rather. And since there was no historical or written interpretations on both sides, it is only left to the Crown to get the best deal they could out of the whole mess. Now we are seeing the treaty being manipulated into the new treaty. And this new treaty comes under the NRTA, that's the Northern Resource Transfer Agreement, which was initiated 14 years. So that was a lie. That the first broken promise was the Northern Resource Transfer Agreement, which attacked the foundations of the communications that the people wanted established, which they could rely on to carry the discussion of what they meant. Because they're obviously meaning something, yet the language base to understand that was not there, other than through a biased linguist like the missionaries who were there, and also some of the Métis people who understood both. So the commissioners relied on that method to carry the message. Now with the NRTA came the first break, and from then on, the 1920s, until the 1960s, when up pops the colonial government with their white paper policy, which was specified to deliberate and to recreate with, again, the alien language, and in this case it's English, of how they can access and gain a land deed. And basically that's what they have been always after, was a land deed. And they call it sovereignty. And sovereignty for the global community, which was settlers, immigrants, all of the people from the whole world that came into our territories and our lands. The language base for acceptance of that bright idea was just not there. I remember my father saying, if they want me to vote, because he was handed a voting paper to vote, he said, let them live here thousands of years, then maybe I will lend them my name. In other words, lending my name meant to vote. That's what voting was interpreted. So there was a whole line of linguist and language confusion going on. And our people, as was predicted back in the 1800s, would undergo tremendous change. And the survivors, eventually after the more than 300-400 years of adjustment, the survivors, and this is where we are at now, the survivors, remnants, Treaty 10 descent are now remnants, and Treaty 10 descent now have to look carefully at the wordings, because we were handed the ability to expand a capacity to be linguists, to be able to speak Dene, which was under attack, and to be able to grasp the idea of what they were trying to relay to us. There's still a big, big wall that can never be overcome. Treaty 10 is a ruse, and as soon as the NRTA was initiated, the Indian Act was created. The Indian Act is a wordy affair, but it is still just a simple funnel. A funnel that had a long spout where they put in allocation dollars into the bowl, but they didn't necessarily pour the resource that had been agreed on to treaty and to treaty descent. It was aimed at ways to attack the land base, to attack the people occupying the land base, and to remove them. Trickery, shysters, con games is the mantra of all that development from 1906 in our case, and 17th century in the case of the people we in the Atlantic, and stopping pretty well in the mountain areas because BC is partially unceded, and now the full attack of the new treaty design is being implemented there, because we get a lot of court cases happening from BC, which is affecting us too as well. But the ones in British Columbia are well argued to convince thinking colonial judges to realize that in spite of the propaganda, there was still the truth of the presence of our people, of their people, and the indigenous people that still are part of this land.
Okay, now.
Cashew Bear Treaty Pen News.